Here on Kiwi, 25 minutes away from 9. Screening tonight on TV3 at 7:30 p.m. Inside Child Poverty, a special report. Documentary maker Bryan investigating child poverty here in New Zealand, where we are 28 out of 30 countries in the developed world. That's our poor record on child health. Bryan joins me on the line this morning. Morning to you, Bryan.
Morning, Glenn. How are you?
Very well, thank you very much. Now, when we think of poverty, we normally associate it with like slums somewhere in India or something like that. Places that look entirely overcrowded and rubbish in the streets, that kind of thing. But what does poverty in New Zealand look like?
Poverty, if you're a child in New Zealand, means that you probably haven't had breakfast this morning. Poverty in New Zealand means that your shoes that you're wearing to school probably have got holes in them and and that you're a subject of a charity or maybe get a pair of shoes. That you probably go to school without a raincoat. That your parents can't buy you a bike or to get anything like that. It's relative poverty.
Okay.
What's happened in New Zealand is there's an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and our kids have suffered as a result.
And they've suffered in their health. 25,000 children were admitted to hospital last year. With what kind of problems, Bryan?
Most of those problems were totally preventable. They're to do with respiration. And as I understand it, I'm not a doctor, but I've spoken to paediatricians and paediatric surgeons. And they tell me that your house can kill you. A lot of our houses, are, particularly rental properties, are damp, mouldy, and that's the conditions in which the diseases of poverty like rheumatic fever thrive. Now, I filmed a lot in Porirua. It has one of the highest rates of rheumatic fever in our country. A disease that has been eliminated in places like Sweden. Hasn't been there for maybe since the 60s.
And these houses in Porirua, they're the classic sort of state house, aren't they?
Well, the ones I went into were. But to be fair, Housing New Zealand has got a healthy housing program. They just wouldn't talk to me very much about it. And you would have to ask them why not. I mean, the reality is, Housing New Zealand, the national government, the Labour government, all the parties know that you have to improve the housing to improve the health of children.
So these particular houses that you were looking at,
yep.
They struck me as very damp, as we saw, mould on the ceilings and walls and windows and that sort of thing, and lots of cramped sort of living conditions with people living in one room. But these houses have been there for a long time, probably I guess since the 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
Have they always been like that?
Have you had a look at the drain pipes and the things like that? There's no maintenance has been done on these properties. Would you like to live in a house that you saw on the preview of the documentary?
No.
And we should, the first young lady that invited me into her house said, "I'm ashamed to let you in here," and I said, "I'm ashamed to be your landlord," because that's what Housing New Zealand is. They're us. When we talk about the Crown, we talk about us.
Yeah.
When we talk about Housing New Zealand, we talk about us. It's about what are we going to do for those, for those families and those children. Specifically
with the issue of the dampness in the houses, though. I mean, is that down to maintenance, or have they always been that way?
No, it's to do with power poverty. And you can keep a house warm and dry using electric power. Yeah. But most of these people can't afford electric power.
So those houses were previously heated by tenants who used to be able to afford power?
Or, A, afforded power, or B, could light fires, because they had open fires.
Right,
like that.
And those have been taken out?
Well, the people don't use them anymore because, there are various restrictions on using fires now.
Yeah.
Electricity costs a lot of money. What I'd like to know is that, Housing New Zealand's got 70,000 properties. Why doesn't it bulk buy electricity for its 70,000 properties? They've got smart meters. They could then put it on their client's bill, and that way, newborn children wouldn't have to go and live in a damp house and end up back in hospital 2 or 3 weeks later with some respiratory illness. I mean, I don't know whether you know about mold, but it travels by spores.
Yeah. Are the size of families living in these houses getting bigger? Are they bigger than they used to be?
Yes, Pacific Island families tend to be larger, but it's not the size of the family that matters, it's the size of the house. And how and overcrowding is about actually all sleeping together, because it's so damn cold you all sleep in the same room, and that's when bugs get transmitted.
Okay, so housing is you would say, and from what the experts are telling you, there's a number one issue.
Yeah. You can't inoculate against poverty. It's okay to talk about $12 million for rheumatic fever, but if a child goes back into a house that's cold and damp and mouldy, it's going to get reinfected.
Yeah, and we're talking also about skin conditions as well, aren't we?
Yep. Scabies is rife. A lot of skin conditions that don't have to be transmitted are a result of people all huddling together to keep warm in winter.
I remember at school, you have a kind of a sort of a child's eye on what sort of goes on. But I remember the one kid in school who had scabies at the time, and it was a big deal, and that kid was helped out and obviously sent home or whatever happened. But anyway, the kid came back healthy once more. But do we now have schools in New Zealand that kind of accept that scabies is sort of part of the norm?
School sores particularly. If you go into any decile 1 school in New Zealand, you will find school sores. What is happening is that children are not being taken to the doctor because it's expensive, particularly if it's after hours. If you have got parents that happen to work, it's very difficult for them to get away from work to take their kid to the doctor. So they go on the weekend, and then it's hellishly expensive. It's a good thing that parties are saying, let's have free childcare, health care for under 6s.
Yeah.
But it's too little too late. We need to get all children onto free health care, and that's possible. If you have you may not have got to the part of the documentary where I go to Sweden.
Tell us about that. Yeah.
There is a better way. Well, Sweden is a country that is very similar to us. It was a social welfare state which became a free market economy, just like us. It went through hard times in the 1990s, but their kids didn't suffer because, unlike us, they didn't allow their children to get sick. Just because of the change to the free market economy. And how they did it was they decided to spend most of their money on prevention rather than cure. So in every Swedish school there was a nurse. In every Swedish school the doctor visits twice a week. In every Swedish school, rich or poor, children are fed a healthy lunch every day. Now, I came back to New Zealand, did the maths, and we can do that. I got some figures, unfortunately too late for the documentary, on Friday from the Ministry of Health that said, I asked how many children had operations in New Zealand under the age of 14 last year. The answer came back something like 24,000. How much did that cost? 142 million. So I spoke to paediatricians and said, how many of those were preventable? They said conservatively half.
Wow.
So that's $71 million available. When you divide that by the number of children under 14 in New Zealand and say it's $20 a visit to a GP, every child in New Zealand could have gone to the GP 4 times last year for what we could have saved in preventable operations. We're just not working smarter.
Politically, though, it's tough, isn't it, to remove that money from the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and put it at the top?
Politically?
Yeah.
This is not a political question. This is an ethical and a moral question. We all have to get together and figure out how we're going to solve this. And what I'd like to see is a commitment from all the politicians that after the election, whatever shade of colour they are, that they sit down and talk about this and come up with a long-term plan for our children, just in the same way as we came up for the over 65s and our superannuation. The only problem is that kids can't vote.
So there's an interesting time to release this documentary with the background to everything right now being the election.
Yeah.
Is there a party out there with a policy that can solve all this? Look,
they've all got bits of it. That's why they should all talk together.
So they need to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Whoever's in power, their economic policy determines the life of our children. Doesn't matter who gets in.
Yeah.
So therefore the state has a responsibility to all children. There are people out there saying, it's about bad parenting and all of that. Kids don't get to choose their parents. The state has a responsibility. If you have a look at the documentary, you'll see that Sweden understands that, and it provides a protective umbrella for all children in their country. We're good people. We can do that too.
We used to do it, right?
We absolutely used to do it. And we've forgotten. And if you watch the end of the documentary when you finally get there, Glenn, you'll see that I ask us to remember the lessons that we know, that we learned, that we once knew. We built state houses because we knew that unhealthy houses spread disease. And it's not just about giving nice houses to the poor. The reality is that diseases that grow up in slum houses can come in and affect you and me, mate. we can get ill from those diseases.
Yeah.
So there's something in it for all of us.
How significant, by the way, was the Milk in Schools program?
Absolutely significant. I came to this country. I was born in Scotland. I grew up in the slums of Edinburgh in a place called Leith. And my parents came to this country to give me a better life. And when I got here, this country gave me free milk and a free education. And I live in a really good part of Wellington now. And I'm talking to you on a telephone about, I've got a good job and all of that. I owe this country an awful lot. But I owe it to the government who gave me free milk and a free education. And that's where this all started from. I wanted to know what had happened to that country.
Yeah.
We can have it back. What we need is to have a fair market economy, not a free market economy. We can't have it's time to get rid of the free market economy that allows people to get incredibly rich and make our children incredibly unhealthy. So we need a fair market economy, not a free market economy. Can't go back to social welfare, but we can go back to fairness.
It's hard to fault that argument, Bryan. The documentary is screening tonight at 7:30. It certainly is an eye-opener, and I encourage everyone to watch this on TV3. Inside Child Poverty, a special report, 7:30 p.m. Bryan Bruce is a documentary maker. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
It's now 8:46 here on Kiwi.